wasn't it like Jung's theory of when like different characters represent different things? What's that called, Joe?
or the archetypes of the unconscious.
Yeah, that's it.
Mm. And how Jesus is a symbol, really, and he represents many of the deep sort of archetypal ideas that we have. Like, it's sort of just, I'm just going to expand the point that you just made, but I really like it, and I've talked about it in the past, of how like um, Jesus is a hero, right? And it doesn't matter whether he's actually walked on water or arose from the dead, right? What's important is what he represents, which is that voluntary acceptance of the suffering of life, and through that he was given eternal life, right? Or he relieved humanity of original sin, right? He basically took away the evil that humanity was struck with, right? And that's what the message of the Bible is. But in a way, you're so right. Like the Lion King, for example, has a lot of similarities to the story of Jesus, right? Simba thinks he killed his dad, right? That's one of the worst sins you can commit, right? I mean, we know he didn't. We know Scar like set him up or whatever. But what he does then is he goes away from the homeland. He gets banished, right? And then the way he turns it around is he voluntarily accepts what happened, and he goes back and he takes back Pride Rock. Do you know what I mean? And you watch that as a 6-year-old kid, and that all makes sense to you, right? For some reason, this complex narrative of like cartoon lions talking to each other in English, like, but for some reason you're like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense, because it is like it does seem like we have these. This is why I find Jung so interesting, because I think we do have these fundamental like stories of the human experience that we can relate to from so early on in life. And like the hero, I think, is to me the most important and prevalent of those. And I see it show up in so many, like you said, in entertainment, movies, TV, books, but also religions as well. So yeah, I think that's a good takeaway for people to get from this for sure.
Awesome. Have you read Young then?
Have I read Young?
Yeah.
I've read some Young a long time ago. Not a long time ago. I started reading Young for like during the pandemic. And I don't. You probably can't see, but I have his red book behind me actually in my office. So I had a whole phase of Young. It was basically like in 2020, I discovered Jordan Peterson's original Maps of Meaning lectures at the University of Toronto, and then I read Maps of Meaning. And then actually specifically his lecture on Pinocchio really like was so profound, and I still think about that particular lecture to this day. I don't know if you guys have seen it, but there's a scene in Pinocchio where the boys are being carted off to Pleasure Island, and they're being turned into donkeys. Do you guys remember this scene?
I think I've heard Peterson talk about this Pleasure Island bit. I don't actually know the bit from the story, but carry on. I'm interested.
So I watched this as a child, but I totally forgot what happened. And then I rewatched it after listening to Peterson's lecture, and it is profound. Basically, this exploitive villain gets the young boys to go to Pleasure Island, and he tells them they could do whatever they want to do. They can drink beer all day, they can destroy property, they can play pool, smoke, whatever. And over time, as the longer they stay on the island, what ends up happening is that they start turning into donkeys. And then this villain takes them and like sells them off into slavery. And it is like such a scary but such a thoughtful way to do a villain. It's probably one of the darker villains in the Disney canon, and I'm not sure why I brought that up, but it's worth watching, because I think it illustrates like how if we aren't willing to give ourselves up or surrender to coming to consciousness and being conscious of the pain that we must endure in order to live awakened lives as human beings, what we risk is actually falling asleep, and not just falling asleep, but falling asleep in such a way that we are easily carted off into slavery, which I think is like the ultimate teaching of that. You know, Pinocchio dispenses with his conscience in that scene, like he tries to get away from Jiminy Cricket, the conscious, who represents the conscious. There are all these little interesting symbols within the larger symbol of Pinocchio. But yes, to answer your question, I have read Jung. I've read Man and His Symbols, and I've read so much Jung that I actually don't remember what I what I read. I don't know if you have explored any of some of his female colleagues' work. Again, like Marion Woodman, Helen Luke. They sort of, so Jung talks a lot about manhood, and Helen Luke and Marion Woodman talk a lot about womanhood. They speak a lot about womanhood within the context of Jungian archetypes, which I find very, very spiritually nourishing as a woman. So just a side note, but two people who you might find interesting if you want to deepen your knowledge of Jungian thought.
Yeah. I remember in Pinocchio, Peterson talking about there's the story of, like, I think it's Joan and the Whale, where Pinocchio goes to free his dad or something. I think that's got biblical links.
Yeah.
And what was Maps? Was Peterson's first book, Maps of Meaning, right?
I believe that was his first book.
Yeah. Was that a good one? I've only read his 12 Rules for Life.
So I've only read Maps of Meaning. I haven't read 12 Rules for Life. Yeah, I mean, Maps of Meaning was super Joseph Campbell-esque. Super like the hero's journey-esque. I read it, like I said, in 2020 during COVID. I remember it being very good. Obviously, he writes the way he speaks. So if you're not familiar with Peterson's style of speaking, then you might find his writing annoying. However, I had watched the lectures first, and then I read the book, so I knew what I was getting myself into. But I found it very good. I found it very compelling. There's this really beautiful quote where he says, your job is to see your fellow human as a burden, or no, a divine being heavily burdened might yet see the light, something like that. And that's one of the more sacred poetic descriptions of human beings that I've read from anyone, including Peterson. So I remember being struck by that. But I have Maps of Meaning behind me here as well, near the Red Book. So.